Keep us voiceless, you try to keep us down, but we are backing out because the time is now. Screaming till you're breathless, till all the voices drown, but we ain't backing down. Oh, our time is now. Don't wanna treat the liar, don't wanna be the fire. Tell me what to do. Hey, hey. Listen in the heart, leading me from love. Tell me what to do. Tell me what to handle something undefined. Give me a reason to raise the stakes, 'cause I can't walk away. You keep taking the upper hand and you're leaving me exposed. I don't think I stand a chance when your feelings never show. Your love is a wild card, folding is the hard part. I don't know if you'll hold me, or leave me here feeling lonely. Your love is a wild card, can't let this go too far. I don't know if you'll hold me or break my heart, 'cause your love is a wild card. Always came out that for round two, but you're still face down. I can't get to you. I'm in the red, so cut to the chase. What will it be today? You keep taking the upper hand and you're leaving me exposed. I don't think I stand a chance when your feelings never show. Your love is a wild card, can't let this go too far. I don't know if you'll hold me or break my heart, 'cause your love is a wild card.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third WebMardi online. I'm happy to see all of you. I see more and more people coming, like 16 people actually on YouTube and few on Twitch. Before we start, I'd like to present a bit the WebMardi. So the WebMardi is a meetup that happens every first Tuesday of each month. And we have someone that will talk about design, the new framework that just went out last week, or anything related to the web. And the association is run by Cami, Nelson, Kevin, and myself. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course, you can watch all our videos on YouTube and follow us on Twitch as well. For tonight, we are going to have the intro and then the talk from Romaric. And for all the questions, you can use the chat on YouTube. We will moderate the comments and we will ask those questions at the end of the talk to Romaric. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we will bring them later for the Q&A. And then we will announce the next WebMardi and we will close the event. WebMardi is supported by LEAP and Antistatic. They are here to help us financially to sustain the association and also to pay the apparel when we make physical events. We are also partners of JetBrains and Smashing Magazine. If you have any question, you can also ask them later in the YouTube channel. So tonight we are welcoming Romaric Drigon. Is a PHP developer, and he has been doing and working a lot on Symfony projects. And tonight he is going to talk about how to structure your code to tackle complex domains. So Romaric, I'll let you talk then.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Geoffroy, for inviting me. Many thanks to WebMardi for organizing this event. Many thanks. So let's get started. Tonight we'll talk about complex domains, what it is, and how to tackle those, how to code, what are the strategies and patterns you can use. First of all, a note about myself. I work as a software engineer at ICIT in Lausanne. So here it is. We work on technical maps. Maybe you can see a map over here. We help people, like anyone, toward electric grid map, for instance, from Romaric Drigon, etc. And for a long time before, I worked as a consultant with SensoLab, the maker of Symfony framework. And then I was going project to project. And that's how I got interested into software architecture. So let's start with the statement, an observation. Most web apps deals with non-trivial tasks. Can be online booking if you work for booking.com. If you work for any shop like Amazon, Digitech, e-commerce, where you have to do selling, e-commerce, but you also have to manage stocks, you have to do invoicing, billing. It's quickly getting complex. And then the question is how to code those easily, how to know what to code without too many bugs. Bugs free, maybe not that much, but at least with test and knowing how to handle the edge cases and how to code something easy to maintain. If you take most enterprise projects that have a really long lifetime, a software you code today in Nespresso could last for 10 years, 5 years minimum, 10 years. So then you really want to have something easy to maintain, which can be used for a long time and adding new features, etc. So let me start with the story. A few years ago, I was working in a startup and we were developing a new software which was like a small ERP. If you are not familiar with ERP, let's say it's a software doing everything in a company. So in our case, we are working with lawyers. So some lawyers were buying this piece of software and it was handling emails, their agenda, etc. They needed to do every day to track legal cases they were working on, like sending an email to a customer, putting some audience in the agenda, even storing in something which was like a Dropbox files about a legal case, about declaration, etc. Everything they needed to do every day. It was a pretty big project. In numbers, we were 8 developers. I was lead developer for 6 months. And during those 6 months, we wrote about 60,000 lines of code. We are using Symfony framework. So it was quite a big project. During this presentation, I will tell you how we went through different steps in this project and what are the tools and the method we used. Though we use a Symfony framework, most concepts are not PHP specific. There won't be too much code in my presentation. Actually, there will be almost none. And there are things you can use in JavaScript. I did some Vue.js recently, or you could use in any language, I believe. At first, the project was looking quite difficult, quite big. It could have been an hour story. We could have gotten really quickly in those 6 months 60,000 lines of spaghetti code. So we need to organize. I started looking into solutions, tools, methodologies to help us. The one I found, I really like it, was domain-driven design. Here I put the cover of the very first book on the subject by Eric Evans from 2003. That book actually coined the term. It invented a new field of software architecture. And it was quite a revelation to me. We discovered some new method and how to handle things about a domain. But then, what is a domain? Well, in a nutshell, the domain is what you are trying to solve. It is the problem your software is trying to deal with. So, for instance, in our application, it was legal case management. So, tracking legal cases and generating letters when you need to do, scheduling all the events in the case, sending the invoice after the work is done to customer, etc. The domain is legal case management. And then, according to domain-driven design, what you want to get is a model of that domain. It's quite linked to object-oriented programming. At least I will tell you how to use DDD with object-oriented programming. You could use it with functional programming or event-driven programming, etc. That's not something I experience. So, in a nutshell, that talk will be how to understand the domain, how to model it, and how to code that model in our project. Then, first step, what's the domain? What is legal case management? I knew nothing about that. I did not do any legal studies. So, what it is? How to discover legal case management? And the answer is quite obvious. You get to meet business people for whom you are making the software. So you get to discuss with them, and then you will learn the words, you will learn the small subtleties, what you want to do. It's quite obvious, but it means an iterative process is required. You cannot really do DDD or learn anything from the business people or even meet business people if you do waterfall management. Or if you work in some big organization where you have silos like IT department is separated from other department. No, you need to physically meet people. You cannot just get a Word file, what I call a communication through specification, and learn something from a Word file or Excel file. So I listed a few tools we use to meet people, interviews, or discussing on the whiteboard. So you cannot see, but in my room actually we have a huge whiteboard we use a lot to do schemas and to discuss ideas. Sometimes it's easier to visualize if you have mockups or wireframe. Some people are really visual, so it has more impact. So you can do paper mockups, sketches, or you can even use Adobe XD or that kind of tool. Some processes are best described as workflows. So there we have the example of abandoned cart workflow. Without getting too much into the example, you draw a small workflow of what's happening and how you react to those. In some cases, workflows are quite complex and you need some specific method. One I quite like is called event storming. The page is a method to discover business processes. So you use a big whiteboard and sticky notes. So you can see on my screen those blue sticky notes with business people, with stakeholders around. You will list the different events happening. For example, someone orders something. So then you put a blue sticky note, someone orders something. And then you will put what you do after, how you react to that event. and maybe it will lead to another event. Maybe there will be a risk. Maybe there will be a branch, like someone passes an order, you can validate or decline the order, etc. And in the end, you get something like the picture on the left of my presentation. You get a good model, a good visual model of what's happening and what are the different branches. Give you a good picture. I put the link below of a blog post. So in all my presentation, there will be links of blog posts, online documents or books, for instance, Even Storming by Alberto Bondolini. If you want to dig further in a specific concept, I quite encourage you to have a look. The second part, now that we know what is a domain, it is to model it. And actually, the first tool before going to code is the language. For a complex domain, before getting to code, you need to really clearly articulate and explain concepts. And that's where you get ubiquitous language, which is a term from domain-driven design. You could define ubiquitous language as a common, shared vocabulary where words have a specific and well-defined meaning in the context of your application. So the goal really is to have the same vocabulary in the team of developers or with the business people you met, with your product manager or product owner, and not to have any ambiguities in the communication. You could take, for instance, a type. In all applications, you have types everywhere. But what is a type? So a user type, is it private, public, or is it someone to validate, or someone whose account is blocked? No, so you define once and for all that user type means exactly this. And then you write those definitions to a small document, to a small glossary. So there I put a screenshot of the document we wrote together, where we had definition of every concept. And that was a shared document with the whole team. So everybody was using the exact same vocabulary. And then when someone was asking me a question about a user type, I knew what exactly to answer and what he was referring to. That document is a living document. That's not something you write and forget. That's something you continue every day to add definition to it. And you update, maybe you remove words, etc. The document I took the picture of is in French. We're a French-speaking team. Can be in any language. You don't have to use English all the time. I mean, if you're working with some really specific language, sometimes it's better to use the language of the team. Let's move to another tool, which is called bounded context. With bounded context, the idea is to divide and conquer, to make your app easier to code. You divide it into smaller pieces, into smaller domains. Again, let's take an example from our project. So at the beginning, I show you this schema where we have the different components, the different part of our application, and then we divide it. The calendar context, mail context, drive, documents, user, which was not in my schema. And then for every bounded context, you define really clearly what's inside and what's outside, which information you are storing there, and what you will be keeping only there. In more details, I took a schema from Martin Fowler-Bliquet, which is really great, by the way. Here you have an example you could imagine from Digitech or Amazon. So they are selling stuff to people, and then in the sales context, you have a product you sell to a customer, somewhere you have opportunities, etc. And then after the sale is done, you have a support context. Then again, you have customer and product, but maybe has been calling you about an issue, so then you get a ticket, and behind you get a defect, etc. So you really divide every concept, and sometimes you have concepts which are in two different bounded concepts. You have concepts in two different bounded contexts, but then you may split those. For instance, the product I'm selling you, the product in yellow, in the sales context, it may be the latest up-to-date product with the latest information, versus the product in the support context. It is something you bought 3 years ago. So maybe you want to store different information, like at that time that product specification was that, those were the features. So you divide. To draw an analogy with something trendy now, you could think of bounded context as microservices. Technically, it does not have to be separate apps. It's the same. You split everything, and then you have one application for user, one application for products. Everything is split really clearly. Technically, it can be bundles. If you use Symfony, it can be packages, it can be modules, folders. The really important part is that bounded context is helping you to segregate your different objects and concepts. Getting to the third part, now that we have a model, we want to code it to capture the model we discovered. The idea is to split the domain code, the model you got, with all the business logic from the infrastructure. So domain code, for example, will be an user. What is a user object? User has a name, first name, last name, etc. It's a PHP class describing the business. The infrastructure code is, for instance, a database access. How you save that user to the database, how you send an email to the user. All that is infrastructure code. And you want to really split code dealing with the business, code describing the business, versus code with only technical aspects, infrastructure code. In example, I put a screenshot of our app in the Drive bounded context. The Drive bounded context was the robots-like thing. In the Drive context, we had entities. We are using Symfony framework with Doctrine ORM. So you have entities which are objects containing persisted data, but then also business logic. And we had also a model folder with objects we were not saving to the database. So those classes, they are the really important part of your application. There, you want to have some really expressive code which contains business logic, code which base some information. So on my example, you see you have a constructor with argument, because there you cannot build something without a low-fin. You have some what I call clever methods. Then they have a really descriptive name. You have a name constructor who are using interfaces. We are really trying to convey a lot of information. To have something you can read, and when you read that snippet of code, you know, okay, it's doing that, and that's what it means. Versus sometimes what you get is an anemic model. That's really something you don't want to get. That code is only getter and setters. When I read this code, it's verbose and it's useless. I have no idea of what this piece of code is doing. Does it require a date or not? Do I have to set a position, etc.? You really want to avoid that. Anemic model actually is called an anti-pattern for a reason. It is that if you don't put any business logic into your model code, then you will have to put that logic everywhere, and typically it ends up in services, or sometimes we call those managers. And you get that kind of really bloated code, which is super complex, which is basically a spaghetti mess. So again, prefer to have expressive classes versus anemic model, and then bloated classes, which are really hard to deal with 1 year after. But sometimes just using objects, just using classes, as I say, is not enough to describe a domain model. Maybe you have something which is more complex. It has many branches. It's hard to follow. It's describing something lasting over several days. And then in that case, you need something more to structure your code. And that's how you get to architectural patterns, to something I call architectural patterns. I will again recommend a specific book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture by Martin Fowler, which is a little bit old, I think now, likely 10 years at least, but it's still relevant today because it's telling you about structures you can use for your model code, and not that much about technologies which may change. An example of structure you can use of an architectural pattern is the dispatcher pattern, where you throw events and listener react to events. So that's something really common. Most frameworks today have a notion of events, or if you did any front-end JavaScript, you dealt with events before. So you throw events, and then you have a listener somewhere reacting to event, but listening and then reacting to event. So it allows you to decouple the event from the listener. Listeners tend to be pretty small. They do one thing well, and they can react to different events. So you avoid duplication that way. At the beginning, it's a good pattern, but in my experience, in our application, after a while, I found that it was hard to follow what is going on. Everywhere you had events, and it was not quite clear which listener was reacting to which event, and sometimes a developer could forget to fire an event, and then you would have some mail not sent. So it's a good pattern to start with, but watch out, after a long time can get messy. I will give you a second pattern, which is something a little bit different. Earlier in the talk, I discussed about workflows. There on the screen, you can see a small example from a blog post, blog article, which is pending review. And then someone is reviewing the blog article, and either it is rejected, either it is published. So that's a really small workflow. But then you can get some tools to easily code those workflows. And it will help you to keep that workflow in the domain model. I won't get into too much details of how to code that because you need likely a library for that. For instance, in our case, we use the Symfony workflow component. I put the link below. You can check it out, or I'm sure you have workflow libraries in JavaScript, etc. The third pattern, again, so every of those patterns are to be used in different situations. You cannot use a workflow instead of events, etc. They are to be used for different scenarios. So a third pattern is a command bus, which is best used when you have a code with a lot of different inputs and different outputs. To simplify, you can imagine the command bus is like a mailman. It will distribute mail, messages, commands on the left to handlers. Handlers will run operation on commands, but then because of the command bus, you can decouple the input, the command, from the handler. It's also easier to branch with the command bus. It's easier to deal with high load with command bus. It can really help in some difficult scenarios. Components are used before to deal with those where tactician, which is something from the League of Extraordinary PHP package. So it's not something Symfony specific or Symfony Messenger. And finally, last part is about design patterns. So maybe you are using some architectural pattern to structure your app, but then you have a small piece of code, a small unit, which is hard to write, and you feel like that it will be hard to read, hard to test, and hard to maintain, especially in 1 year. So design patterns are really great guidelines to help you structure that small piece of code, that small class, and to explain also what you're doing to others, to other developers, or to your future self about what you have done. So there are many. I put a few on my generic builder, command, DTO, factory, repository, specification. And those are all code patterns we use in our app, in that project. Each would deserve presentation by himself. So I won't get too much into details. You have some great resources around. That's not something I wanted to explain tonight, but it's worth having a look from time to time into learning new patterns. So I will try to summarize everything I said. Back to the story, back to my project. All the tools and methodologies I told you about, we used, they work pretty well. the project, the 6 months of the project I work went fine. We could meet major deadlines. We could easily integrate new developers, onboarding them, explaining what the application was doing, giving them the glossary so they knew what were the concepts. And we could release in time a first version. And because that first version was quite well built, easy to understand, the code was easy to understand, it was well documented, then adding new features is easy, and the development of the project still continues today. I put a small screenshot of the application as of today. To give you some feedback about the strategies, meeting business people, the first thing I told you about, is really great. It's not always easy. If you work in an agency or if you work remotely, it's less convenient. You should try to organize around. Using a common vocabulary, the ubiquitous language was really helpful. It really helped us explain to new developers and communicate in the team about what we were working on. Splitting the big project into smaller pieces with bonded context help us work on every context and every part independently. So it's really a good thing if you work on a big project. And finally, coding a rich domain model is something I would advise you to do in every project. Having business logic somewhere in your app is really helpful. It will, because business logic stays for a long time. It's really a big plus. And finally, some feedback about patterns, about both architectural and design patterns. They made code way easier to understand. All the patterns I told you about, which were workflow, events, common bus, but also the design patterns, they help us to decouple small units of codes. So because those were small units, they were faster to work on. So productivity was better. It was also helping teamwork as simply as having less Git conflict. Smaller units are also easier to test. And the only downside there that at first, at the beginning, you need to give more explanation about what you are doing. If not all developers in the team are familiar with the pattern you are using, then it's worth to do a small presentation or a small tutorial about how to use that pattern, what are the different resources about it, and some examples. So no developer is getting afraid of the pattern or is getting lost. So that was all. I realized I spoke quite quickly, so then we have plenty of time for question. Geoffroy, I will let you with question. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Romaric, for your talk. Indeed, we have few questions coming from YouTube. I will tell those questions. So the first question we got was by David, and the question is: how do you keep duplicated concepts in two bounded contexts in syncs?
So it really depends case to case. It is quite uncommon to have exactly the same entity, the same concept in two bounded contexts. If I go back to my example with product.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going there quickly. Oh, I'm being too quick for my app. Okay. So if we take that example, the product you have in support context does not contain the same information than the product in the sales context. So actually you would get a sale product and the support product with different information. And each other, they may know their ID, their identity, but that's all. You don't quite duplicate any information. There is only one scenario where I can imagine that you really need to duplicate some information. It is when you miss a context. If you have exactly the same concept you need to have in different contexts, usually it is the sign that you need to have a separate context responsible only for that concept, and then from other context you will get only the ID of the information. You don't duplicate anything.
Okay. But then to make those two contexts talking to each other, what would be the contract? You could use an API, right?
Yeah, so if you do your bonded context in different apps like microservices, you use an API. If you are not using different apps, you may be tempted to cross-reference objects, but ideally you don't do that. You try just to use the ID of objects not in your current context. Exactly if you are using an API, you try to keep the same logic to really decouple every bonded context.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the answer. David, if ever you want more information, just write again in the chat if you need more details. We have another questions coming from Sidbug. Sidbug said, it was interesting to see ABQ's language being used with French stakeholders. Did you translate name of entities as well? I figured out that must have been added some ambiguity.
Yeah. So again, it really depends. In our very specific scenario, when I bootstrapped the project, I started to use names in English. So the document was also used as a translation, as a glossary of French names versus the English names used in the code. In that project, the code was only in English. But it doesn't have to be that way. I remember meeting people which were working for some horse training center, and then they have to deal with horses breed. And it's really hard to translate the name of a breed to another language, specifically that how you define a breed in one country may be different than the criteria used in another country. So they were doing code in French, and I think can work out also fine.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that explanation. Another question. Except the book from Martin Fowler, what other resources would you recommend to read when it comes to code architecture?
Actually, that's quite a tough question because I would answer everything from Martin Fowler, and then I'm a little bit short on books to recommend. I feel like the topic of web application architecture was not quite studied, was not maybe taken as seriously as enterprise architecture for the past years. I know that Matthias Novak is writing a book on the subject about structuring PHP code he has been publishing books like Hexagonal Architecture, which is a quite specific architecture. So I would say Martin Fowler, Matthias Novak for something a little bit PHP specific. On DDD, you have the book from Eric Evans. Even if the book is quite old, it's still relevant because it's about methodologies and concepts. It's not too much about technologies. You have Vought Vernon, who is also quite active in DDD, but I don't know if he published anything recently. So on top of my head, those are the names I would recommend. And I can write those down after.
Yeah. And thank you for that. Do you have any recommendation on which person would you recommend to follow to learn about code architecture, like on Twitter, for instance?
So the funny thing is that usually the most proficient writers and speakers don't use Twitter much. So there would be different names. Matthias Novak is posting just a little bit. Vought Vernon is posting a little bit, but mostly to promote his workshop. In PHP world, Matthias Verais is posting some interesting content. Actually, Matthias Verais has been doing workshop with Alberto Brondolini on event storming. So also it will give you more information about event storming.
Yeah.
Again.
Okay, thank you. Question again from David. Did you find any pitfalls in using the patterns where they didn't quite work out in practice for your use case?
There are pitfalls, but in my experience as a consultant, the pitfalls you get from using patterns are, let's say, less worse than pitfalls of not using patterns. As a consultant, I was called way more time about having some spaghetti code, about having 10,000 lines of PHP. No one knew what they were doing versus having a factory pattern which was not quite working about. But still, it was easy to transform into another pattern. So there may be pitfalls, but refactoring from one pattern to another usually is quite easy. Even for architecture, I mentioned that event pattern, so dispatcher pattern using events is not always easy. When you get really large code base, it's getting complex. It's hard to follow what's happening, even with tools. But then I found that it was quite easy to refactor part of the events toward, for instance, a common bus or workflow.
Okay. So basically, use design pattern as they are common things and they have been used in other places. So it's easier for people to understand what the code is doing. And there might be some pitfall, for instance, when using the dispatcher events, because you have like a lot of events that are triggered in and there. But other than that, use design pattern.
Your code will be, the pitfalls from using pattern are better than the pitfalls of not using patterns. So don't be afraid of picking the wrong pattern. It will be easier to refactor after.
Okay. Thank you for that question, that answer. When it comes to code architecture, we have to name things, and as we all know, it's not always easy to find names for things. Would you have any recommendation on to name things in the code?
That's a tough question. Use German. It has more descriptive names. Really, if you use English, so on the screenshot, you can see that we used a lot of composed names. And actually, that was not quite a joke about using German. So I took the example of a type, that it is hard to define what is a type. But then maybe you can just define what a user type is, and then you may have a calendar event type, which is something different. So using composed name, it may sound a little bit Java-esque, but actually it's becoming more descriptive. Well, that's a good option.
Okay, and I guess also using comments can also be something to makes your code more understandable by others. If, for instance, the name of a function is not expressive enough, and or you can express all the logic behind this. So using comment, or maybe decoupling things. I don't know.
Yeah, but you have a nice effect when you set up that ubiquitous language, that vocabulary gets a really specific meaning. Then later, when you tell someone about a type, they know what you are talking about.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes to have some really specific definition is actually making communication easier and more concise, because people get exactly what you are telling about.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay, so those were all the questions from the audience. So I guess if we don't have any more questions, I propose that we switch to the next part. Thank you again, Romaric, for being here tonight and for your presentation about that topic. I heard that if you added your contacts information, so I guess if some people have questions, they can also reach you on GitHub.
Yeah, exactly. They can reach me on my blog, so on GitHub, or they can reach me on Twitter, or I will tell around a little bit also on YouTube comments. So feel free to reach.
Okay.
We cannot have an online beer, sadly, but usually I quite like to discuss around a beer, so we can do by email.
Okay. Thank you very much, Romaric.
Thank you.
For the next event, so in the next event, we're going to talk about Jane. That's a tool that is being used by Baptiste Leduc, and he will give you all the insights that made his life easier when building APIs. That event will be again live on YouTube, and it will happen on the 1st of September. The event will start at 7 p.m. sharp, and you can always subscribe to our meetup group to get informed about our next event. Another event that will also happen in September, the SEO Nerd Switzerland is holding an event online, and that's going to be about JavaScript and page speed performance. And there will be Martin Splitt, the SEO guru from Google, that will be there. So it's free. You can also join. It will be also an online event like the WebMarty. And it will happen the 3rd of September. So if ever you want more information, you can just hit the link there, bit.ly/with-Martin-Splitt. As I said earlier, you can always find all our videos on our YouTube channels. So if ever you want to rewatch the talks or to just watch the other one that you missed, just go on youtube.com/webmardi and you will be able to see all those events. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. We were around 15 people between YouTube and Twitch, and I'm looking forward to see you the 1st September for the talk on Jane API made easier. Thank you very much for your time and see you. Bye.